to our Parent Experience series, where we talk about general topics that relate to the parent experience of caring for a child with an orthopedic condition. Today, we're welcoming back Jacob Codner to talk about when you should contact your medical provider. So, as a parent of a child who's actively in treatment for an orthopedic condition like clubfoot, it can be kind of hard to determine when to contact your medical providers and when not to, especially if you're a parent that hasn't had any experience in the medical realm prior to your child's condition. So, how did you navigate this on your child's treatment journey?
I'm a pretty inquisitive person. So whenever I had a question, I did try to ask it. And I always try to ask it to the doctor because he's the one that sees us day in and day out. And if you go to third party resources, whether it's online, things like that, I've felt and I still do feel everyone is a little case by case and it's a little different. So even though that information you may be getting from someone that's not a trained medical professional could be helpful and could be beneficial, you still would take it with a grain of salt. I know there's been times I've looked on Facebook groups or other means of resources for small things such as, what type of socks to use, or, where is someone getting their bracing from today if it was a piece missing and they didn't have it in stock. Things like that can be a good resource. But when it comes down to actual medical treatment, I do not believe you should ask anyone outside of your care provider. I am a firm believer on, if you have a question, you should ask it, no matter how minuscule it may seem to you. You should just get it off your chest. That one question you may not ask could have a domino effect on treatment that you have no clue what it can cause.
I think that's such a good point. I think that when we're in appointments, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to ask all of the questions and remember everything. But the reality is, those appointments can be very short, and they can also, you're trying to navigate having your child there. Like, you're still a parent in that situation with most likely a toddler, a young
Yeah.
child. I've never had an experience with a doctor or a provider who was like, no, I really don't like answering questions outside of appointments,
No.
right? They're like, if you
Yeah.
have questions, ask me. And so it's just that point of like, hey, I forgot to ask this. Does this? And then they can decide whether or not, it's like, oh, no, that's not a big deal. Or, yeah, oh, actually, yeah, we should look into this further, because you're not going to know if you don't ask, right?
Yeah. And one of the things that I continue doing throughout treatment, because the more time that takes place during treatment, not only is the treatment working, but the parents are getting
Mm-hmm.
more educated, and with more education comes more questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So along that process, if I had a thought or a question, I would write it in my phone, in my notepad.
Mm-hmm.
So when I would actually go to the visit, which early on, our visits were every week rather. So time lapse wasn't much. It was every week, and unless it was something super urgent, I could wait a week to get my question answered. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but during that time, I would have, it's not uncommon, I would have 10 questions to just say, hey, I have a few questions for you. I want to run down my list for this week. And then it actually became kind of like part of our treatment, where our doctor would say, okay, what do we got today? And
Yeah.
he was great about it, very cool about it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with any questions one may have.
Was there ever a time where you were like, you had a question on the list, but you were like, this isn't, I don't think I really need to ask my provider, but I do want to find an answer. So where would you go to find that answer?
There is groups out there, again, Facebook support groups for clubfoot. There's several out there, so I would say just find one of the groups with the most members.
Hmm.
And you can find a lot of information out there, but again, I would just mention, take some of that information with a grain of salt, because what may have worked for one person may not work for you. And also try to avoid looking at all of the medical sad stories and treatment stories that you can see there, because that may not apply.
Yeah, I think that's such a great example, that sometimes it's not a medical related question, but more of an experience related question. And
Mm,
those are the things that I ended up going to other parents for. Like, what kind of
Yeah.
clothes should we wear? What kind of baby carrier did you guys use? Like stuff
Yeah.
like that, where you're like, my medical provider probably doesn't need, this isn't really a question that may pertain to them, but it's still a question that I have. So trying to
Yeah.
determine which ones go where and filtering those questions can sometimes be a little bit tricky. So what do you recommend to parents who are trying to decide whether it's worth contacting their provider or they should be looking for a different resource?
I would say, if you're ever weighing where to go, do both. I mean, why
Hmm.
not? And doesn't hurt
Yeah.
to. And one thing that I've learned too is that the clubfoot community, if you have a question, there's so many eager people to help you answer it.
Hmm.
And that's that's really been a cool thing that we've learned through this process is that those support groups, they are there to support one another. As I mentioned, there's sad stories in them from time to time, but when there's a picture of a clubfoot cutie graduating boots and bar, that comment list is so extensive with congrats or you go girl, you go boy, awesome, rock and roll. And it's just like you almost have a family outside of the immediate family that would help be there for one another. It's a cool thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jacob.